What if I told you that the same decision-making framework that prevented nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis could transform how you handle every major choice in your life? In the next 30 minutes, I'm going to reveal the secret weapon that American presidents have been using for over 70 years to make decisions that literally change the course of history. This isn't just theory. This is the exact four-quadrant system that Dwight Eisenhower, the man who planned D-Day and led the Allied victory in World War II, developed when he realized that being president required a completely different kind of decision-making than commanding armies. By the end of this video, you'll have mastered 4 core skills. First, you'll understand how real presidents used this matrix during actual crisis situations that shaped our world. Second, you'll learn the scientific principles behind why this 4-quadrant system works so effectively for both world leaders and everyday people. Third, I'll give you practical techniques you can start using immediately in your personal and professional life. And fourth, I'll show you the common mistakes that cause most people to fail with this system, plus the advanced strategies that separate truly effective decision makers from everyone else. Before we dive in, I want to hear from you in the comments. What's the most difficult decision you're facing right now? Drop it below, and I might even analyze it using this presidential framework later in the video. Let me take you back to 1953. Dwight Eisenhower had just been sworn in as the 34th President of the United States, but he was struggling with something no military training had prepared him for. As Supreme Allied Commander, his decisions were primarily tactical: move this division here, attack at dawn, coordinate with the British forces. The stakes were enormous, yes, but the decision-making process was relatively straightforward because he was dealing with clear military objectives. But the presidency was different. Every single day, dozens of issues landed on his desk. Some seemed urgent and demanded immediate attention: a crisis in Korea, a political scandal brewing, congressional leaders demanding meetings. Others appeared less pressing, but were potentially more significant for the country's future: education, policy, infrastructure, development, long-term economic planning. Eisenhower quickly realized that without a systematic approach, he would either spend all his time putting out fires while neglecting the truly important work, or he'd get paralyzed trying to evaluate every decision with the same level of intensity. Drawing on his military experience of strategic planning, Eisenhower developed what would later become known as the Eisenhower Matrix. The first time he publicly referenced this approach was during a speech at Northwestern University in 1954, where he quoted a former university president: "I have 2 kinds of problems, the urgent and the important. The urgent are not important, and the important are never urgent." This simple distinction would become the foundation of a decision-making system that has guided presidents, CEOs, and high achievers for decades. Now, let's break down this 4-quadrant system that has shaped presidential decision-making for over half a century. Quadrant 1 represents tasks that are both urgent and important. Think of this as crisis management territory. When President Kennedy faced the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, every decision fell into this quadrant. Soviet nuclear missiles were being installed 90 miles from American shores. The situation was undeniably urgent. Each day of inaction increased the risk of nuclear war. It was also undeniably important. The wrong decision could have meant the destruction of civilization as we know it. In your personal life, Quadrant 1 includes genuine emergencies, medical crises, critical work, deadlines that affect your job security, major relationship conflicts that need immediate resolution. The key insight that presidents understand is that you should spend no more than 25% of your time in this quadrant. Why? Because if you're constantly in crisis mode, you're not actually leading, you're just reacting. Effective leaders work hard to prevent issues from reaching Quadrant 1 in the first place. Here's where most people go wrong. They label everything as urgent and important, when it's really not. That email from your colleague? Probably not. Quadrant 1. That meeting request for next week? Definitely not Quadrant 1. True Quadrant 1 items have immediate consequences and significant impact, if not addressed right now. Quadrant 2 is where the magic happens, tasks that are important but not urgent. This is where presidents spend most of their strategic thinking time, and it's where you should spend 65 to 70% of your time if you want to achieve extraordinary results. Consider the Marshall Plan, developed under President Truman and implemented by Eisenhower. Rebuilding Europe after World War II wasn't urgent in the immediate sense. There was no crisis demanding action within days or weeks. But it was profoundly important for America's long-term security and prosperity. Similarly, when President Kennedy announced the goal of landing on the moon, it wasn't urgent. The Soviets weren't about to attack from space. But it was important for America's technological leadership and national identity. In your life, Quadrant 2 includes skill development, relationship building, strategic planning, health and fitness routines, financial planning, and educational pursuits. These activities don't scream for your attention because there's no immediate penalty for ignoring them. But here's what successful people understand. Quadrant 2 activities have compound effects. The time you invest in learning a new skill today pays dividends for years. The effort you put into building relationships now creates opportunities later. The attention you give to your health today prevents crises tomorrow. Most people neglect Quadrant 2 because our brains are wired to respond to immediate threats and rewards. We feel productive when we're busy handling urgent tasks, even if they're not actually moving us toward our goals. But here's the counterintuitive truth. The more time you spend in Quadrant 2, the fewer Quadrant 1 crises you'll face. Quadrant 3 contains tasks that are urgent but not important. These are often other people's priorities, masquerading as your own emergencies. Presidents deal with this constantly. Every reporter wants an immediate response. Every congressman wants an urgent meeting. Every crisis seems to demand presidential attention. Effective presidents have learned to delegate, delay, or decline most Quadrant 3 activities. They have chiefs of staff, press, secretaries, and cabinet members specifically to handle urgent but not important tasks. In your life, this might include non-essential meetings, interruptions from colleagues, social media, notifications or requests that feel urgent but don't actually advance your goals. The key to managing Quadrant 3 is developing what I call graceful resistance. You need templates for saying no, politely but firmly. Here are 5 phrases that work. I'm not the right person for this. This doesn't align with my current priorities. I can't commit to this right now. Have you considered asking someone else? And this sounds important. What's the real deadline? Often, when you probe the urgency, you'll discover it's not actually urgent at all. Quadrant 4 represents activities that are neither urgent nor important. This is time-wasting territory, mindless social media scrolling, excessive television watching, gossip, unnecessary online shopping. Presidents have very little Quadrant 4 time because their schedules are so tightly managed, but most people spend far more time here than they realize. The goal isn't to eliminate Quadrant 4 entirely. Everyone needs some downtime, some activities that are purely for relaxation and enjoyment. The problem occurs when Quadrant 4 expands to fill available time, often because we're avoiding more challenging Quadrant 2 work. If you find yourself spending hours in Quadrant 4, it's usually a sign that you're either overwhelmed by Quadrant 1 crises or intimidated by important Quadrant 2 projects. Let me show you how this framework played out during 3 pivotal moments in presidential history. The Cuban Missile Crisis lasted 13 days in October 1962, and it remains the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. President Kennedy faced an impossible choice: allow Soviet nuclear missiles to remain in Cuba, risking American security launch airstrikes to destroy the missiles, risking nuclear retaliation, or invade Cuba, potentially triggering World War III. Kennedy's team used a systematic approach that mirrors the Eisenhower Matrix. They identified what was truly urgent. The missiles were becoming operational and had to be addressed immediately. They clarified what was important: preventing nuclear war while maintaining American credibility. They eliminated options that were urgent but not important, like responding to every provocative Soviet statement. And they stayed focused on the strategic goal, rather than getting distracted by less critical issues. The breakthrough came when Kennedy realized that while the situation was urgent, the most important objective wasn't necessarily the most obvious one. Instead of focusing on removing the missiles, he focused on removing them without starting a war. This shift in thinking led to the solution: a secret deal to remove American missiles from Turkey in exchange for Soviet missiles leaving Cuba, while publicly agreeing only to not invade Cuba. It was a Quadrant 2 solution to a Quadrant 1 crisis. Fast forward to June 1987. President Reagan stood at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin and delivered one of the most famous speeches in presidential history. "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Many people don't realize that Reagan's team debated removing this line from the speech right up until the last moment. State Department officials argued it was too provocative and might damage ongoing negotiations with the Soviet Union. Reagan's decision to keep the line demonstrated perfect Quadrant 2, thinking the speech wasn't responding to an immediate crisis. The Berlin Wall had been standing for 26 years. But Reagan understood that this moment represented an important opportunity to communicate American values and put moral pressure on the Soviet system. He was thinking beyond the immediate diplomatic concerns to the longer-term goal of freedom and democracy. 2 years later, the Berlin Wall fell. For a modern example, consider President Obama's decision to pursue healthcare reform during his first term. This was classic Quadrant 2, decision-making, important but not urgent. The American healthcare system had been broken for decades. Waiting another year or two wouldn't have created an immediate crisis. But Obama understood that major reform requires political capital that's usually only available early in a presidency. He chose to spend enormous time and energy on a Quadrant 2 priority, even though it meant less attention for other issues and significant political risk. The lesson for you is that Quadrant 2 decisions often feel uncomfortable because they require you to say no to urgent-seeming requests in order to focus on what's truly important. But this is exactly what separates effective leaders from busy people who never seem to make real progress. Now, let's talk about how you can apply this presidential framework to your own life. In career development, use the matrix to evaluate opportunities. That urgent request to take on another project might be Quadrant 3 if it doesn't advance your skills or career goals. Meanwhile, that online course you've been meaning to take is probably Quadrant 2, important for your long-term growth, but easy to postpone because it's not urgent. The job offer that requires an immediate decision might feel like Quadrant 1, but take time to evaluate whether it's truly important for your career trajectory. For entrepreneurs and business leaders, the matrix becomes even more critical. Customer complaints feel urgent and important, but some are really just urgent. A client who threatens to leave unless you immediately implement their requested feature isn't necessarily presenting a Quadrant 1 situation if that feature doesn't align with your product strategy. On the other hand, investing time in understanding your core customers' long-term needs is pure Quadrant 2, work that many businesses neglect because it doesn't feel urgent. In team management, share the matrix with your team members. Help them understand which types of issues truly require immediate escalation and which ones they can handle themselves. This prevents your calendar from filling up with other people's Quadrant 3 items while giving you more time for strategic Quadrant 2 leadership work. However, there are 5 critical mistakes that can undermine your success with this system. Mistake number 1, labeling everything as urgent and important. This usually happens when you're stressed or overwhelmed. The solution is to force yourself to step back and ask, what would happen if I address this tomorrow instead of today, next week instead of this week? Often, you'll realize that very few things are truly urgent. Mistake number 2, completely eliminating Quadrant 4 time. This leads to burnout and actually reduces your effectiveness in other quadrants. Schedule some guilt-free relaxation time, but be intentional about it, rather than letting it expand randomly throughout your day. Mistake number 3, making classifications based on your emotions rather than objective criteria. Just because something makes you anxious doesn't make it urgent. Just because something is easy doesn't make it important. Develop scoring systems or criteria that help you evaluate urgency and importance more objectively. Mistake number 4, treating the matrix as static rather than dynamic. Your priorities change as your circumstances change. What's important for you today might not be important 6 months from now. Schedule regular reviews, weekly for your immediate priorities, monthly for your broader goals, and quarterly for your life direction. Mistake number 5, confusing personal priorities with organizational priorities. At work, your manager's urgent request might be Quadrant 1 from the organization's perspective, but Quadrant 3 from your personal career development perspective. You need to balance both, but be honest about the distinction. Let me share some advanced techniques that can take your decision-making to the next level. But first, consider adding a time dimension to your matrix. Create separate matrices for this week, this month, this quarter, and this year. Something might be Quadrant 3 this week, but Quadrant 2 this quarter. Second, evaluate the energy required for different tasks. Schedule your most important Quadrant 2 work during your peak energy hours, not during the leftover time after you've handled urgent matters. Third, consider the ripple effects of your decisions. Sometimes a Quadrant 3 task becomes worth doing because completing it prevents multiple future Quadrant 1 crises. Fourth, develop trigger systems that automatically move items between quadrants. For example, if a Quadrant 2 project hasn't been touched in 2 weeks, it automatically becomes Quadrant 1 priority. Before we wrap up, let me address a question from the comments. Era asks about choosing between 2 job offers, one with higher pay but longer hours, and one with lower pay but better work-life balance. Using the matrix, we first clarify what's truly important to you long-term. Is it maximizing income, developing specific skills, maintaining health and relationships, or building toward a particular career goal? The higher paying job might be Quadrant 1 if you have urgent financial needs, but Quadrant 3 if the extra income doesn't align with your important goals and the longer hours prevent Quadrant 2 activities like skill development or relationship building. The lower paying job might be Quadrant 2 if it gives you time and energy to invest in important long-term activities. The key is being honest about what's truly important versus what just feels urgent or impressive to others. To implement this system successfully, start with a 4-week plan. Week 1. Spend time understanding the framework and observing your current decision patterns without trying to change them yet. Week 2. Begin categorizing your tasks and requests, but don't worry about perfect classifications. Week 3. Start actively managing your time according to the quadrants, focusing especially on protecting Quadrant 2 time. Week 4. Evaluate what's working and adjust your approach. Remember the 3 core principles that make this a presidential-level framework. First, importance trumps urgency in the long run. Second, preventing quadrant 1 crises is more effective than managing them. Third, your ability to say no to good things determines your ability to say yes to great things. The presidents who have used this system most effectively didn't become successful because they were great at handling crises. They became great because they prevented crises by focusing on what was truly important before it became urgent. That's the shift in thinking that can transform not just your productivity, but your entire approach to life. I want to hear how you're planning to apply this framework. In the comments, tell me which quadrant you currently spend too much time in and which one you need to focus on more. Are you stuck in quadrant 1 crisis mode? Neglecting quadrant 2 strategic work? Getting pulled into too many quadrant 3 activities? Or spending too much time in quadrant 4? Also, let me know which historical decision maker you'd like me to analyze next. Should we look at how Winston Churchill used strategic thinking during World War II? How Steve Jobs applied focus principles at Apple? Or maybe how Eleanor Roosevelt balanced competing priorities as First Lady? If this presidential decision-making framework has given you a new way to think about your choices and priorities, hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. I create in-depth content like this every week, covering leadership, principles, productivity, systems, and decision-making strategies used by the most effective people in history. Share this video with someone who you think could benefit from better decision-making skills. Maybe a colleague who's always stressed about urgent requests, or a friend who has great ideas but struggles to make progress on their important goals. Next week, I'm diving into another presidential leadership secret: how Abraham Lincoln used what psychologists now call emotional regulation techniques to make clear-headed decisions during the Civil War, and how you can use these same techniques to think more clearly under pressure. Until then, remember, the quality of your life is determined by the quality of your decisions, and the quality of your decisions is determined by the framework you use to make them. You now have the same framework that prevented nuclear war and guided some of the most consequential decisions in human history. Use it wisely.